In this video, I want to talk about emissions taxes. We have a photograph and quote from Arthur Pigou. No invisible hand, clearly referencing Adam Smith, can be relied on to produce a good arrangement of the whole from a combination of separate treatments of the parts. It is therefore necessary that an authority of wider reach should intervene to tackle the collective problem of beauty, air, and light, and so on. He's talking about externalities, whether they're positive or negative. In that authority of wider reach, he's thinking of a government or a regulator. So the fundamental problem with negative externalities, or problems of pollution specifically, is that those generating pollution aren't paying or incurring the full cost of their activities. And so the simplest way to correct this is to put a price on pollution. This is the idea of an emissions tax. There are many ways to tax or price polluting activities. The one I want to focus on is called the uniform emissions tax. It's uniform because everybody is going to face the same tax level, which is going to be a price per unit of emissions. And the way to think about this, the simplest way to think about this, is a tax imposed on an industry. You could think of electricity plants using fossil fuels to generate electricity, and they have to pay a fixed dollar amount for every metric ton of emissions. That could be carbon emissions or carbon equivalent emissions. If we're talking about greenhouse gases more generally, it could be sulfur dioxide. These regulated entities will face the same dollar amount for each unit of emissions. So before we introduce the theory of why economists favor policies like uniform emissions taxes over things like command and control, let's just look to policies that have uniform emissions taxes, and we can think about the carbon price or the carbon tax in British Columbia and Canada that was implemented in 2008. The uniform tax per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions is in the $60 to $70 range. And it started off as low as 10, kind of ramped up over time. A uniform emissions tax has also been proposed many times to address climate change in the United States. Currently, we do not have a federal carbon tax. But in particular, I want to reference the Climate Leadership Council, which is a group of statesmen, academics, diplomats, largely on the Republican side, that have advocated for exactly this, a uniform emissions tax on carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. So the overarching point is that although we don't have an emissions tax like this to govern greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, there are other countries that have implemented these kind of taxes, including the one in British Columbia and many in Europe and Scandinavia. But also, there are many proposals in the United States to implement exactly this kind of regulation. And here's a screenshot of Milton Friedman, a storied Nobel laureate in economics, who's known for free market capitalism and limited governmental control. Who's quoted here, and I've posted the video so you can understand the context, is saying the best way to reduce emissions is to impose an emissions tax. 1979, Milton Friedman. All right, let's explore how a firm would respond to a uniform emissions tax. And then we can kind of extrapolate that to how all firms would respond to a uniform emissions tax. And then we can discuss the economic implications. So let's say we have firm I, and their marginal abatement cost is 20 minus 2E. And of course, E is their level of emissions. Now let's graph this firm's marginal abatement cost. All right, this is firm I's marginal abatement cost. You can see that the unregulated level of emissions would be 10 units. Now let's consider a regulator that imposes a uniform emissions tax of T equals to $10. So for every unit of emissions that this firm and every other firm emits, they have to pay $10 to the government in the form of taxation. So what we want to consider now is how does the firm respond? What's the emissions level that they actually choose when facing a uniform tax of $10? How much do they pay the government in the tax bill, and how much do they incur in total abatement cost or in abatement cost? So to start, let's put the tax value on our graph. All right, so the pink dotted line is that $10 uniform emissions tax. What is the firm going to do? At this point, their unregulated point, right? The marginal abatement cost is less than that tax rate in this area, right? The marginal abatement cost is less than the tax rate. So that means that it's cheaper for the firm to abate their emissions, to clean up their act, rather than emitting those units and paying the tax, okay? And that holds up until this point, up until the point where their marginal abatement cost equals their tax. You can consider, okay, well, what are the incentives above this point, right? In this range. Well, here, the marginal abatement cost is greater than that per unit tax. What does that mean? That means that it's more expensive for the firm to reduce its emissions relative to just emitting freely and paying the tax. And so ultimately, these incentives mean that this is going to be the level of emissions, right, with the superscript T to indicate under the tax, that the firm would choose. And most importantly, that the firm's choice of emissions will be exactly where the marginal abatement cost for the firm equals the per unit emissions tax. So for our example firm, this is pretty easy to solve. The marginal abatement cost is 20 minus 2E, and the tax rate is 10. And so we can solve 10 equals 2E, and E, we'll put a T there, equals 5. So the emissions level for this firm, if facing a uniform emissions tax of 10, would be to reduce emissions from 10 to 5 units. But what should be immediately clear is that we could have thousands of firms in an industry, all with different marginal abatement costs, but each is facing the same incentive, where if the marginal abatement cost is lower than the tax, it's cheaper to clean up. When the marginal abatement cost is higher than the tax, it's cheaper to just pollute and pay the tax. And so no matter what the marginal abatement cost of all those firms in the industry is, it's going to be equal to the tax. And since the tax is uniform, it must be the case that the marginal abatement costs of all firms in the industry are equal under a uniform emissions tax, which means that under a uniform emissions tax, the equimarginal principle holds. So this cloudy little rectangle here is the amount of taxes that this firm pays. And think about why? Well, from 0 emissions at the origin to 5, which is their choice of emissions under the uniform emissions tax, they have to pay $10 per unit. So 5 times 10 is $50. And so the tax bill for this firm is $50. Now, they do clean up some emissions, right? Their unregulated level is 10, so they clean up 5 units of emissions. And in this triangle here, this kind of striped triangle in orange, this would be their total abatement cost. See, does that show up? Yeah, that's fine. That's going to be 1/2, right? 5 times 10, so that's 25. And so the firm pays $50 in taxes and incurs an abatement cost in total of $25.